Hi, everyone. Thanks to those of you who are joining us in person, and for those joining us virtually as well. I know you can't see me on camera, but I promise I'm here. My name is Jacob Brains. I'm a senior at Denison and one of the co-coordinators of Denison's nonpartisan voter engagement initiative, which also goes by DU Votes. We've been hosting a faculty panel series since mid-September discussing a variety of elections issues. Earlier today, those of you might have been with us on Slater third floor or virtually talking about Black Lives Matter and social movements. And this evening, we are really lucky to be with two faculty from the political science department, Dr. Andrew Katz and Dr. Thomas Kelly, who will be talking about domestic and foreign policy. And I'm just going to let them take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jake. So I just want to start off by making a couple of general comments. I'm not exactly an optimistic person. I don't usually look for the silver lining behind every cloud. But one of the things that I have observed as a result of COVID is something that Denisonians do very well. And I want to commend you for that, which is social distancing, wearing your masks and such. That's all. That's really, really good. And I applaud you for that. Similarly, we live in a society now that is rent by political polarization and the inability, apparently, to engage in productive discourse. And I'm hopeful that Denisonians also can demonstrate well how you can engage in democratic deliberation and civil discourse. So I thank Jacob and Tate for arranging this and for inviting us here. And how shall we proceed?
If you would both like to get started with just kind of general opening remarks, maybe foreign policy first and then domestic policy, kind of key trends.
Or should we start with the vice presidential debate?
You can do that. Let's go with what's most immediate.
Okay, good. So I don't know if people had an opportunity to watch the vice presidential debate. It was quite a contrast with the first presidential debate, certainly. Both participants did engage with each other. There was a good share of interruption and the like, but I think both candidates achieved what they wanted to achieve. Kamala Harris was able to be the prosecutor, but the friendly, smiling, not overly threatening prosecutor. And Mike Pence was able to use his radio background with his soothing voice to nevertheless deliver a number of stinging charges against the Biden-Harris team. He certainly did appear during his performance that he wouldn't hurt a fly. I thought that would go over better. I think it went over better in Zoom land.
Yeah, they're muted, but it went over great.
Oh, okay, good. Okay. So that's all I really wanted to say about the debate. I developed that line there. So observations about the debate?
Sure. I thought the debate was interesting because it was like very stereotypical. We were trying to take a class on like what are the essential ideological commitments to each party? What's their main basis of support? I feel like you could have thrown them in the debate and you would understand it pretty well. To be honest, at times it felt like a little dated, like some of like the criticisms of each other were things that I hadn't heard mentioned in a long time. For instance, like discussing ISIS in terms of foreign policy is something that I haven't really thought of in a couple of years, at least in terms of its political context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the strategy there for Pence was to bring out a couple of foreign policy things that they perceive as vulnerabilities for Biden. Specifically, that Biden was against the attempt on bin Laden. And so when Pence brought up the assassination of al-Baghdadi, not only did Harris and Biden criticize it, but also it gave him the opportunity to say, well, when Biden was vice president and there was opportunity to assassinate bin Laden, Biden's arguing against doing so.
Yes, I agree. It was kind of sorry. It was also a little you see with the debate seating, it was kind of a throwback, or not a throwback, but similar strategy at the State of the Union or at the 2016 Trump-Clinton debates, where the audience was used very strategically. Like here's someone who's been like clearly would benefit or has been hurt in the case of the Mueller family by Biden's record.
So we basically divided up the election contest into domestic and foreign policy. Foreign policy is my area. So a couple of areas in which I thought you might be interested in getting some insight. And I guess first, what role does foreign policy issues play in a typical presidential campaign, and what role is it playing in this particular presidential campaign? Up until 1992, which was, of course, eons ago, there was a certain hurdle that a presidential candidate had to get over. And that is, was this presidential candidate credible as the opposite number against the leader of the Soviet Union? Would this candidate be able to prosecute the Cold War effectively? Of course, with the end of the Cold War, that criteria sort of disappeared. And so now in this COVID era, we're really not talking much about foreign policy at all. In addition, given Biden's experience, given the fact that he was for a time the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he has the bona fides to be a foreign policy president. So basically, there's no reason for either campaign, other than sort of what we were just talking about a moment ago, to emphasize the foreign policy weaknesses of the other, or for that matter, even to highlight what they want to do when it comes to foreign policy. There are a couple of ways, nevertheless, in which foreign policy, does enter into the campaign. For example, you've seen a number of events occurring over the past few months where President Trump has basically been trying to establish his identity as a diplomat, as a president who has been able to make the big deal and achieve great things. Primarily, this is in terms of brokering the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel on the one hand and the United Arab Emirates on the other, as well as Bahrain. There's also now, in the last few weeks, a lot of chatter about the prospect of Sudan opening up diplomatic relations with Israel. And that is sort of one of the many October surprises that might come out in the next couple of weeks. In addition, the Trump administration is putting a lot of pressure on the Iraqi government to clamp down on groups that have been targeting the United States. So Secretary of State Pompeo warned the Iraqi prime minister that the United States would close the embassy in Baghdad unless they took steps. And the big fear, especially on the part of Pompeo, but on the administration more broadly, is that there'll be some sort of attack on Americans in Iraq just before the election, which will basically highlight Trump's promise to have pulled the United States out of the Middle East, which he hasn't done, and also leave Trump vulnerable to charges that he was not able to protect Americans abroad. How about something about domestic politics?
Sure. So if you look at the issues that people say they care most about in 2020, it's like strikingly familiar. The coronavirus response has joined what people care most about, but the top issue is still the economy, as it is in almost every single year. One of the big changes from 2016 when people were asked to rank what they cared about is that immigration fell from being highly cited as one of the issues people most cared about to dropping out of the ranks. I think it's pretty interesting. It was such a centerpiece of President Trump's campaign, both in the primary to distinguish himself from the other Republicans, as well as in the general election. A lot of the early opposition to Trump focused on his immigration policies, such as his travel ban and his efforts to build a border wall along the southern border. So the disappearance of it, both in the campaign and the public consciousness, so there's two changes from 2016 what people care about. One is the diminished focus on immigration, and the other is the coronavirus pandemic, which is now one of the top issues. Most of the top issues, the other issues such as coronavirus pandemic, healthcare, and racial relations, registered voters prefer the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. However, the Republican Party still is viewed more favorably when it comes to economic management, which is as people are distinguishing the economy during the Trump administration pre-coronavirus and the current situation, which maybe is not so much, is not blamed for the current economic shortfall. It's really kind of like a reversion to the standard division between what Republicans are viewed more favorably and what Democrats are viewed more favorably. The Republicans are still viewed as somewhat more responsible on economic issues, and the Democrats are much more trusted on welfare programs, healthcare, social and most social issues.
So interestingly, there was a recent survey conducted by the Chicago Council on World Affairs on citizens' sense of what threatens the United States, what most important issues in terms of foreign policy. And the top 7, and this is aggregate of all those sampled. Number 1 was COVID. Number 2 was domestic violent extremism. Number 3, China. Number 4, the global economic situation. Then political polarization. 6th was international terrorism. And 7th was foreign interference on elections. And when you break that down by partisan affiliation, you get a couple of interesting things. For example, Republicans don't put COVID in the top 7. Democrats don't put China in the top 7. Independents put COVID as number 4, and put COVID as number 1 rather, and China as number 4. So the Republican voters also consider Iran and its nuclear program one of the 7 most important problems, and also consider consider North Korea and its nuclear program to be one of the 7 most important problems. For Democrats, in addition to COVID being an important problem, 75% of Democrats cite climate change as an important international concern, and also consider racial inequality as an important concern. So there is a fairly substantial difference between Republican and Democratic voters, with independents sharing some of the preferences of Democrats and a couple of the others of Republicans.
There's a similar split, and actually right now I feel like there's more overlap in some ways between foreign policy and domestic policy, or at least I feel like maybe like COVID is its own bucket. I'm not sure if people are like, oh, this is a healthcare response versus, oh, this is like a global pandemic. But people who say that like coronavirus is the biggest issue are typically Democratic voters, but people who say they're voting on abortion, guns, immigration, or the economy are leaning Trump pretty heavily.
So what does it mean if, in terms of foreign policy, if there's a second Trump administration, or what does it mean if there's a Biden administration? Obviously, it's a difficult task to try to predict what's going to happen. If we were sitting in this room a year ago, no one would say, oh, there'll be a pandemic and things will really be much different next year. So, but what are some of the broad outlines that we can anticipate? Well, if Trump wins a second term, I'd be willing to go out on a limb and say that Secretary of Defense Mike Esper is not long for this world. Not that Trump will have him killed, but he'd be removed the Secretary of Defense. Esper did one too many times, did something that Trump did not like. I would also imagine that he would also clean out a lot of the top military echelon of the uniform service officials. He also has had problems with them. I would imagine that Trump would also, continue the America First agenda, being tough on NATO allies about their commitment to national defense. I would also imagine that Trump would be quite willing to be hostile with Xi Jinping in China on a number of issues that the United States and China have of late that have been fairly problematic. On the other hand, if Biden becomes president, I think we'll see some revival of multilateralism in U.S. foreign policy. I would be willing to predict, for example, that the United States will rejoin the World Health Organization. Biden has made a commitment to go back to the Paris Accords, so that's I think certainly something that is likely to happen. And I think that Biden would probably be much more responsive to the needs and concerns of NATO countries, and probably probably a bit more confrontational on Russia, where there are a number of issues that could spark a lot of discord between the United States and Russia, and probably not that much different from Trump when it would come to China.
Okay, so I think I think in terms of domestic policy, I think it's easier to predict what a second Trump term might look like than what a first Biden term would look like. This is because if President Trump were to be reelected, he's almost certainly going to face divided government. Virtually no one expects the Republican Party to be able to win the House. Second, since the president's party almost always does very poorly during midterm elections, it's unlikely that the Republicans would be able to win the House again in 2022. So if President Trump is reelected, it's very likely he will face 4 terms of divided Congress, where at least the House is in Democratic hands, and the Senate might be as well. If Trump wins in 2020, it's a guess it's a good year for the Republicans, so maybe the Republicans will keep the Senate, plus they'll have Mike Pence as the tiebreaker. However, in 2022, the Republicans will be very likely to lose the Senate. There's 22 Republican senators up for re-election versus only 11 Democratic senators, so that's just a very difficult map to defend. So President Trump would likely face a Democratic House for his full next 4 years and a Democratic Senate, I would guess, for at least half of it. So there's probably some room for legislative action. For instance, you could definitely imagine, I think it's likely there will be another coronavirus stimulus package of some sort if President Trump is reelected. That's something there's a lot of popular support for, and would have to be negotiated with the Democrats in the House. If he's reelected, it could conceivably happen either before or after the new Congress. In terms of other big legislative victories, many of his priorities seem really unlikely. Like on immigration, he's unlikely to get a Democratic House to approve for funding for certain enforcement priorities or construction of the wall. Maybe you could see something with prescription drug pricing. One thing I was struck by what you said with the possible changeover at the Pentagon, or in terms of like appointees, it seems like, especially if the Democrats do well in the Senate elections, but I wonder if the Trump administration will actually have a surprising decrease in turnover because take the education secretary. I'm not sure if the Trump administration will be able to approve someone, get the Senate to approve a new nominee if the Democrats like win 1 or 2 Senate seats. So you might have someone like Secretary DeVos staying for like a full 8 years where you might expect a changeover in the second term. So in domestic policy, I think the cabinet might be a bit more stable than the first term.
Although if Trump wins re-election, his penchant for appointing acting cabinet officials and disregarding rulings of either GAO or of courts and continuing to have acting people in non-acting positions, that will only get worse. And likely all of these questions will get bumped up to the Supreme Court, which if Trump gets reelected for certain, would have a 6-3 conservative majority. Also, what would be very interesting if Trump does win re-election, well, it would be interesting regardless, is the scramble for the mantle. I mean, if Trump wins re-election, then Trumpism is affirmed.
Yes.
If Trump loses, then is Trumpism totally rejected, or is there just this wide open scramble in the GOP for sort of what type of replacement is the front runner?
Well, I definitely think like Senator Cotton and Hawley are betting on Trump's coalition to stay around, whether or not he does. Yeah.
So we have a question about the Supreme Court, which kind of follows up on something we were just hitting on. I think you were citing kind of the top issues that Pew has surveyed on in this cycle, and something that stood out about the Supreme Court is, I think for the first time in decades, Democrats said it was a more important issue than Republicans did. 66% of Biden supporters said the Supreme Court was very important to their vote, while 61% of Trump supporters said it was important to them. What do you make of kind of this change in enthusiasm? Does it kind of lead to higher turnout within the Democratic base? And could you also kind of comment on what's going to begin next week with hearings in the Senate on the nominee that the president has put forward?
Oh, sure. So I do think the reversal is interesting. So if you look at abortion, for instance, gets out the vote for both sides, right? This is something people really care about and have strong feelings on other sides. The Supreme Court has a lot of really important economic issues that for instance, the Janus decision, but a lot of the ones that get most attention or people are most passionate about are the most obvious social rulings. For instance, in the last couple of months, the Supreme Court ruled that prohibitions against sex discrimination also applied in most cases to discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. So that's an example of like a liberal judicial victory with like a conservative court. So this is like a dangerous speculation game, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to say that the people who care the most about the Supreme Court are people who are already pretty educated about politics and are going to have disproportionate high turnout in general. Given the passionate opposition to President Trump among the Democratic voters, I actually don't think it will be as beneficial to the Democratic Party as people think. The stakes are a bit higher, because unlike Scalia and Kennedy being replaced with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, now you have like a liberal justice being appointed with a presumably conservative justice. But I don't see it driving out that many additional Democratic voters.
I mean, the only change outside of the judiciary that I think this portends is that because of the nomination, Democrats will continue to be unified through October. I mean, there will be a monomaniacal focus on the part of the Democratic Party on turnout and on defeating Trump and perhaps on taking the Senate. That might have been the case otherwise, but there are all sorts of ways in which the Democratic Party could have started to become disunified. The history of the Democratic Party is of discord. And I think the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, the way it was done, has unified the Democratic Party. Nothing is going to tear it apart until after the election, win or lose.
So let's pivot to a foreign policy issue. Dr. Katz, you talked a little bit about China and kind of what the future holds based on kind of which administration we see come January. Can you talk a little bit both kind of from a geopolitical perspective, how the president, whoever ends up being in January, chooses to approach the issue of China, and also if you're willing to comment on kind of the trade agreement that was put, or this stage one of a trade agreement with China, and whether we might kind of see that continue under a Trump administration, how a Biden administration might approach trade issues. So kind of a two-part question there.
Okay. So there's a lot of different ways to look at the U.S.-China relationship and the geopolitical landscape that seems to be emerging. One way we can look at it is say, okay, well, China is an economic powerhouse, a rising political actor with increasing military capability. And therefore, China will want to expand its sphere of influence and do things that will run up against U.S. interests. And the most concerning thing would be Taiwan. The United States does not have a defense agreement with Taiwan, but it does have a sort of wink, wink, we will protect Taiwan if China assaults it. Whether or not China would do something like that, I don't think it depends on who wins the presidential election in November. I don't think that China would do such a thing because I don't think that's in China's interest to do. But that would be, I think, first and foremost of the concerns of both a re-elected Trump and a newly elected Biden. Then there's the sort of economic relationship between the United States and China, and that is quite fraught. There was an expectation which was very at home both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party pre-Donald Trump, that if China engaged in the world economy, that China would gradually be transformed into, if not a liberal democracy, at least into a country that respected rules and was cooperative. And the degree to which that has happened has been a disappointment to me. I would imagine that a second-term President Trump, somebody who's sort of known to hold a grudge, would not be cooperative with the Chinese in the second term. Whether Biden would be more likely to try to engage the Chinese on some economic issues of economic cooperation, and perhaps also in terms of global health cooperation, in the expectation that that might lead to other forms of cooperation in terms of a sort of incremental kind of approach to improving relations, I would not be surprised. I think that the Biden administration, if they were going to focus on a particular area of foreign policy concern, it would more likely be Russia, what's going on right now in Central and Western Asia, and also what's going on in terms of Turkey and Russia and Libya, also in Syria. I think a Biden administration would probably also have a bit of a grudge against Putin, both for the electoral reasons from 2016, and also because I think that there was a sense when Putin first came aboard that there would be a possibility of having some sort of relationship, as many thought, but obviously was not to be. And there was a second part of the question was?
Trade.
Yeah. So, Biden has been talking in the campaign about having kind of a Buy America kind of strategy for the U.S. government purchasing, trying to shape tax policy so that companies invest in the United States instead of spending their money abroad. I don't think at this juncture there's any benefit for a Democratic candidate to start pursuing multilateral free trade agreements, even though those probably would be helpful in the long run. So I would imagine for a Biden administration, the first 2 years would be focused on dealing with the COVID problem, rescuing the economy, repairing U.S., what the Biden campaign would perceive as the U.S. reputation abroad, and then await the aftermath of the 2022 midterm elections to start having more ambitious agenda. And interestingly, and this is not connected with those questions, but I think it's an important thing to point out. Essentially, since Jimmy Carter was elected president, most candidates have run as anti-Washington, a Washington outsider. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that right now Trump is running as an outsider, even though he's president of the United States. Biden isn't saying he's an outsider. And I think one of the things Biden understands is the previous 2 Democratic presidencies suffered greatly because they did not tend to the concern of getting a favorable outcome out of their first midterm election. Both Clinton and Obama got shellacked in their midterms, and it really changed the whole dynamic of their presidencies. I would imagine that Biden's going to be quite attentive to that.
I have kind of one more pre-written question, then I want to leave a lot of time for questions from the audience here, and also folks are submitting things on Zoom for us. Want to make sure we hit on kind of the second most important issue that voters listed in that Pew survey this year, which was healthcare. It was ranked number 4 in 2016. The debate about protection for pre-existing conditions was certainly going on then, but there was not a global pandemic going on at that time, nor was there kind of a possibility for a generational shift on the Supreme Court. The U.S.'s leadership globally through the WHO was still there since 2016. The U.S. has left that institution and vacated certainly some of its global health work. So kind of what can we expect with kind of, it seems like 2 very divergent paths come January, depending on who takes power on January 20th as it relates to healthcare. You can take that any way you want, Dr. Kelly, and
sure.
If you want to comment on the global perspective of that as well, Dr. Katz, that would be great.
So healthcare is one of the areas where, in theory at least, it's one of the domestic areas where you could, in theory, see a big change in a second Trump administration. And that's not because of anything President Trump would be likely to accomplish on his own. That is because there's currently a lawsuit against the Affordable Care Act. I don't necessarily expect it to succeed. Essentially, the lawsuit against the Affordable Care Act argues that it used to contain an individual mandate where people were required to either purchase healthcare or pay a penalty to the federal government. It faced different legal challenges, and one of the Supreme Court's decision was it was okay for Congress to require people to have individual healthcare because the penalty they were paying was essentially just a tax that they had to pay to the government. So we were just getting a tax break for holding healthcare. In the large Trump tax cuts in his first 2 years, they eliminated the tax penalty. So the mandate that was justified as a tax no longer exists. And some states and the Trump White House are arguing that the legal justification to uphold the Affordable Care Act no longer exists. If the Affordable Care Act is struck down in a Trump administration, that's where you could see a major shift in healthcare policy, because even if the Republicans, regardless of who holds the Senate, any replacement for the Affordable Care Act would have to be something that President Trump suggests supports, because they're unlikely to have a supermajority. If the Affordable Care Act is upheld, then the Trump administration, there would probably be fairly minimal changes in terms of healthcare. He could continue to offer states waivers from some of the requirements of the Affordable Care Act. So for instance, some states want to offer shorter term health insurance programs that cost a bit less and offer fewer protections. So some states that want that might change their healthcare offerings a bit in the exchange. President Trump talks a lot about the excessive prescription drug prices. Maybe you could see a compromise deal on that, and that's something he could talk about, such as maybe something to do with insulin pricing. There's some other like small but perhaps like worthy healthcare initiatives like the Trump administration might pursue, like they're making it cheaper to donate organs, for instance, or like funding specific research areas. But if the Affordable Care Act is upheld, I think a second Trump term, you would see pretty little change on the federal level. If Joe Biden wins, that's more interesting, and that's where you can see like pretty divergent outcomes. If Biden wins and the Republicans hold the Senate, once again, you're in an area where perhaps it sends a signal to like the court, and they're a bit less likely to strike down the Affordable Care Act. But if the Republicans hold the Senate, there's not much you can do. The second question is, imagine the Democrats take the Senate and decide to maintain the filibuster. In that case, there are some things the Democrats could do. For instance, they could pass really popular healthcare provisions and essentially force the Republicans to either filibuster something popular or vote for like increased subsidies. Another thing they could do with the filibuster is there's a process called reconciliation. This allows the Senate to pass occasional bills with ignoring the filibuster, as long as it's strictly related to budget provisions and it doesn't increase the long-term deficit. So a Biden administration with a Democratic Senate could increase subsidies, so it would be cheaper to buy health insurance if you're buying it through a marketplace. They could do that even if the filibuster existed. If the filibuster is scrapped, that's where you can maybe get something more ambitious, like Biden's expressed his support for a public option. So in theory, without a filibuster, you could get the biggest changes. So essentially there would be a healthcare plan run by the government that you could buy into, even if you weren't low income enough to qualify for Medicaid or old enough to qualify for Medicare. So that's why I think it's harder to predict what a Biden administration looks like in terms of healthcare, because a lot really turns on the Senate.
And one of the things that the GOP was very concerned about when Obamacare first was enacted was that once you have a program and people utilize it, people tend to like it, and their approval of it tends to only increase as time goes on, making it more and more difficult to undo it. So it's pretty much here to stay. If the Supreme Court actually says that the entire act must go away, I mean, that is a nightmare scenario if Biden wins. And it's probably a nightmare scenario if Trump is reelected, because Humpty Dumpty taken apart, it's going to be very hard to put back together.
And in terms of this question of kind of global health leadership in the context of the current pandemic, what did it mean for the United States to leave the WHO and kind of what might happen in terms of the COVID response potentially if we saw a change in administrations and a potential rejoining of that institution?
So basically, since the end of the Second World War, American leaders of both political parties had a particular point of view. The particular point of view was that there are problems out there in the rest of the world that don't directly affect the United States, but at some point, if not dealt with, will come back and be a great problem. That was sort of the lesson the United States learned from the 1930s. And this was an approach that both Democrat and Republican presidents tended to, not just on foreign policy issues, but economic and global health issues. That if you didn't tend to certain kinds of health problems in faraway places, it could spread. Trump does not share that point of view. And so it does not see a downside of leaving the WHO. Regardless of whatever problems one might identify with the WHO, it does enable the international community to address problems in distant places prior to them affecting a whole millions of people. The absence of U.S. leadership in this particular international institution is quite problematic given the fact that we're in a pandemic. And I think it only makes it more difficult to gain cooperation in the future. But this is something that I think is pretty necessary, that there are multilateral institutions designed to cope with certain kinds of problems that do present themselves with some regularity. Not necessarily a pandemic, but other kinds of issues that present themselves with some regularity.
So at this time, if the folks on Zoom can hear me via that snowball mic, hopefully you can. You're more than welcome to submit questions for the chat. And if folks in person have questions, just feel free to raise your hands. Go ahead.
So one common thing that you hear a lot is that a third party vote would be a vote for Trump or would take a vote from Biden. That like any third party votes really benefit Trump, and I'm just curious about what the reasoning behind that is and the accuracy of that.
So if you're some people will say a vote for a third party is a vote for Biden, but Trump Biden supporters or Democrats will say a vote for a third party is a vote for Trump. But if you're a Republican or a Trump supporter, you would just say a vote for a third party is a vote for Biden. So it really depends on your perspective. So for instance, if you're talking about will someone who votes for the Green Party, are they likely choosing between the Democrats and Biden? Yes, that's probably true. But if you're talking about the Libertarian Party, it's not quite as one-to-one match. They probably are taking away from the Republican, but you're not sure. So first I would say some votes for a third party are a vote, where are they coming from, right? So what's the counterfactual? If the Libertarian Party disappears, do those voters cease voting? Do they switch to Biden or do they switch to Trump? And it's probably a mix. Same with the Green Party, but you probably have very few Green supporters that would switch over to the Republicans. So it's kind of things, it depends on who you think owns those votes before the third party exists. Second of all, most of the country lives in states that will not be pivotal to the outcome of the election. So if you live in California, you should feel free to vote your conscience instead of voting strategically, because everyone knows what's going to happen. If you live in Pennsylvania or Michigan, I would say Florida, maybe vote strategically if you're trying to affect the outcome. But in general, I think in general saying a vote for a third party is a vote for Trump could easily be spun the other way. So to me, it's not most convincing.
I often say to myself, okay, we have all these indicators of things that we can somehow interpret to try to figure out what's really happening. I also sometimes to look at the behavior of individuals and see how that might inform us about what's going on. So, the GOP is supporting putting Kanye West on the ballot. And they're not doing that because they're big supporters of Kanye. There's also been some evidence came out recently that the GOP was helping the Green Party candidate get on the ballot. So that suggests to me that certainly in this election, that Republican Party is very interested in increasing third-party turnout to harm Biden's chances.
So next we'll go to a question via Zoom, if that's okay, and then we'll go back to you. Okay, awesome. So I have a question from a Zoom attendee, kind of foreign policy focused. How would a Trump administration differ from a Biden administration on Middle East politics, specifically on issues like Israel's potential annexation of the West Bank, the Iran nuclear deal, as well as Trump's controversial decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel?
Yeah. So Trump is the most pro-Israel president that we've had, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years. Argument could be made ever. The moving of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem is not going to be undone if Biden becomes president. Will Biden be less solicitous of what Bibi Netanyahu wants to do in Israel? Absolutely. Will Biden try to revive a two-state approach to this diplomacy vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians? Probably, but I don't imagine, for the reasons I suggested earlier, that Biden will be investing that sort of political capital in that kind of question for the next couple of years. Trump has basically not only been able to check off items on the agenda of the Israeli right and the Israeli center, for that matter, but has also carved out very strong relations with key actors in the Gulf, the Saudis, as well as UAE. And that is in part by paying attention to who the enemies of these states are, which is Iran. Trump is very anti-Iran, as are the Saudis, the Israelis, and others. I think Biden is more likely to try to engage the Iranians. If that action then makes more problematic U.S. relations with the Gulf states, that might make the Middle Eastern situation a bit more volatile than it is now. I don't think that if Trump is reelected, that he's going to get any sort of deal from the Iranians, but I don't think the Iranian regime is long-term stable either. So that could be a problem later on down the road. While we're on the Middle East, I would just sort of mention a country that rarely gets a whole lot of attention, but it's a country that at any moment could become a big concern. That's Pakistan. A country with a huge population and nuclear weapons, with a whole lot of schisms within the country that could create great problems at any point.
So one of the biggest discussions in both the presidential election, the presidential debate and the vice presidential debate was race relations within the United States. And do you believe that Kamala Harris's questionable record as a prosecutor in California would sway Democrat voters, or the Trump administration's handling of Black Lives Matter protests and for lack of a better word, the lack of approval rating of his handling of the social movement going on would affect Trump voters to switch to Biden? Do you think that would happen?
So let me answer about Senator Harris first, and then about President Trump. So if Senator Harris's record as a prosecutor and later as Attorney General of California were going to matter, it would be in the Democratic primary, where Democrats have like choices between many very similar candidates, right? And then they can say like, you're like slightly worse or better on this one dimension that I care about, right? There's not great evidence that vice presidents really matter that much. So it's hard to imagine that people, regardless of how great you think one of them did at the debate, many votes being switched on her behalf. Interestingly, with President Trump, so first of all, if you compare like, there's some debate about exit polls, but if you compare like President Trump to Mitt Romney, Donald Trump did better in 2016 with voters of color than Romney did, and slightly worse with white voters. The difference was that his vote was like much better distributed geographically. So like, winning by a few tens of thousands of votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I think that you're seeing an increasing gender gap in politics. I think President Trump's response to Black Lives Matters and other social issues is probably costing him a lot of votes among college-educated whites. But his approval has crept up a bit with Black voters or Hispanic voters. Whether or not that's surprising to you, but that's like what the polls are showing.
Thank you.
I guess my question is, how has the coronavirus been so politicized? And I guess my most recent example would be the attempt to kidnap Governor Whitmer and the recent Michigan Supreme Court ruling that for acts under the state of emergency were unconstitutional. And I guess also the media response to calling them a militia group versus domestic terrorists.
Well, I'll start with COVID.
Sure.
you know, it's not hard to politicize something, and COVID became politicized. You know, this is a political act. Would things be different if it weren't? I'd like to think it would. I would like to think that if we didn't treat COVID as a political issue, but as a public health issue, that the United States would have fewer deaths, fewer hospitalizations, and maybe some more normalcy in our lives than we have now. The attempted kidnapping of Governor Whitmer is, you know, it's the only thing you could do is laugh, which is tragic. And actually, the FBI had an informant that met with these people in Dublin, Ohio. So interestingly, we're in the center of things yet again here in Ohio. I think that if Biden does win, if he wins even with a substantial margin, there will be still people in our country who will not accept the legitimacy of that election. And that's a very dangerous state of affairs for it.
I guess I also have a follow-up to that. So with the Michigan courts ruling, people, should they just stop wearing masks as a performance of their political beliefs? Like, how does that function as like American identity, like our political beliefs being so highly ingrained that we're willing to put other people in danger?
You're the Michigan.
Sure. So, two things. First, I would recommend people, including fellow Michiganders, to wear masks. It seems like the evidence for it is pretty strong, and I will continue to wear one, including when I go visit family in Michigan. Second, I'm pretty sure, but maybe I'm wrong, fellow Michiganders, that after 2018, Democratic supported justices make up the majority of the Michigan Supreme Court. So my guess is that like it was not like a purely partisan decision, and that Whitmer was probably like maybe taking a very broad interpretation of governor powers, and they were like not necessarily saying it was bad as a policy measure, but just saying it was ungrounded, right? Going back to the militia movement, trying to assassinate someone is an act of like domestic terrorism, so that's like an appropriate label to use. But the militia movement, it's not like a euphemism, right? It's not like, oh, we'll call them militia instead of domestic terrorists. Like the Michigan militia is like a long-standing, like I guess you could say like fringe social movement of like several decades. So like, it's not like either or, right? Michigan militia is not just a euphemism, right? It's like an actual description of a movement in Michigan. They were more prominent in the 1990s, like following the Oklahoma City bombing. People were more worried about them, but they're not a new thing.
How would we label them if they were, say, like the Canadians, or I don't know, from a foreign country? Would we not call them terrorists?
Well, the militia movement is a real ideological movement that contains some terrorists, right? Like people who tried to capture Whitmer. But it's like, you can call someone terrorist and also like, I think like identify the movement they're in, right? You can say like the Ku Klux Klan were a terrorist movement, you know, like you don't, but you're also allowed to label them by the organizational name, right? Or, I think if you try to assassinate someone, it's appropriate for the media to label you domestic terrorist, but I also think it's fine to label the specific movement you're associated with.
I just think there's a real danger within not valuing the extremity of or the severity of the situation and how far polarization has really taken us. And I find that if it were perhaps a Republican governor under a Republican president, it might have been a bigger deal. And I think the media labeling them as a militia first, rather than a group member of the militia who's gone further into acts of terrorism, just explains, or it just provides the sense that it's not important, or like not, I don't know what's better.
Like the media should further emphasize the act of terrorism and less the ideological underpinning.
Right, I think it shows that our American identities are kind of drifting further apart from each other, and just it's a mess.
I mean, I think a good part of politics is defining issues, what are called framing things. When Obama was elected first go around, the FBI, various U.S. intelligence services, were about to issue a report saying that this is going to exacerbate right-wing extremist movements. And Republicans in Congress just raised bloody hell about this. You're labeling us, this is all. And of course, the report was buried, and we didn't hear anything about it again until some of these groups started arising and doing things that caught this attention. Back in the Clinton administration, there was a standoff by an extremist religious group called the Branch Davidians. And the left didn't pay any attention to that, but the right, characterized that as that heavy, boot of government stifling religion and belief. Well, there's this contest that goes on all the time, how we define things. And if you're not engaged in that contest, you're letting others define things. And so I would just encourage people to pay attention and push back. So if you want to push back, push.
So we have a question on the Zoom, and then Michael, I think you had a question, right? I wanted to you, and then Stuart, did you? Okay. You might not be able to get to your question just with the time we have. So the question from Zoom is about the topic of court packing. In both the presidential and vice presidential debates, Trump and Katz tried to use the concept of packing the court against Biden and Harris. How much do you think this issue impacts voters, and is adding additional Supreme Court justices even something we could reasonably expect to see come to pass if Biden wins the election?
Sure. So first of all, I think that maybe people might disagree from what's good for democracy, but I think Biden and Harris are correct strategically to not take a position on that, especially if their position would be something like, yes, we should pack the courts. That's likely to be very unpopular. It was unpopular even under FDR, who was beloved at the time, and even he paid a political price. Second, I'm pretty skeptical of court packing actually happen. There's lots of times where certain parts of the Republican or Democratic Party have wanted to modify the courts to achieve political victories. For instance, Congress creates the jurisdiction of the courts. So after Roe v. Wade, some pro-life activists wanted the Congress to take jurisdiction over abortion away from the courts to set it off limits for litigation, and that never happened. Changing the size of the courts is something that hasn't happened in a very long time. Even changing the size of the courts in ways that you can make a good government argument for instance, the Ninth Circuit is enormous relative to the other circuits, and you might just think as a function of court workload, there should be a 10th Circuit, there should be many more district judges. But even relatively low stakes enlargements of the courts haven't happened in a very long time. So I'd be very surprised if the Democrats were willing to spend so much political capital to push it through in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Biden and Trump with the court packing, and they were trying to spin a narrative that Biden and Harris are radicals, or they're under the influence of the radical wings of the Democratic Party. I would not be surprised if the Democrats took the Senate, though, that Washington, D.C. was not made a state.
Yeah, so I suppose we'll put it back to foreign policy. So my question is, Turkey is a rising actor in both Middle Eastern and European foreign affairs, particularly during the Obama administration. Obama set a real hard line against Turkish interference with American involvement in Syria, but since Trump has been in office, it hasn't really been as enforced, especially with Trump's involvement with having a hotel in Turkey and the relationship between Turkey and Russia. So my question is, how might it change if Biden were to be elected? What should we expect Turkey's involvement in greater Middle Eastern affairs should rise if Trump were to be?
Yeah, so under the best of circumstances, relations with Turkey are always require a lot of attentiveness The United States actually has nuclear weapons on an air base that the United States uses in Turkey. Erdogan is increasingly unpopular in Turkey, and he seems to be using what we in the study of international politics call the diversionary theory of war. He's sort of using international engagement to sort of take the mind of the Turkish voter off the economy and more on how great this new Ottoman Empire is. Turkey is having a problematic relationship right now with Greece in terms of offshore oil and gas deposits. Turkey is engaged in Syria, facing off against Russia and other actors. Turkey is involved in Libya. This is something that if Biden is elected, Biden, I would imagine, would come down much harder on Erdogan than Trump. One, because I think Trump has a thing for Erdogan, and two, he has other issues, as you mentioned, with Turkey. I think the more likely outcome is that the string of Erdogan's rule in Turkey is going to end. That's because of an internal Turkish situation, not so much because of anything U.S. president.
Yeah, so I have a question for both of you, which is related to polarization. I'll start with domestic. So there's been a significant growth in polarization over the past 10 years or so, which had kind of came to its climax in 2015 with the schism between the 2013 RNC report type wing of the GOP and the Trump wing of the GOP, and within the Democratic Party with its left wing and its center wing. So how do you see that being impacting U.S. politics as a whole, and how those parties go, Trump win or lose, or Biden win or lose? And then with foreign policy, we also saw in 2016 that there was a bipartisan effort by countries such as Russia and China to influence our view of each other, and how that impacted the election, and what do we do about that, and how big of an impact do you feel it was?
Okay. I'll start.
Sure.
So I see no reason to expect polarization to diminish. Sometimes after a really big wave election, you can ironically have kind of like a tiny bit more moderation in Congress, because you can have a party win in lots of areas that is generally weaken, right? So the Democrats have a really strong year this year. You would see like atypically moderate Democrats be elected to the House and to the Senate, and so they might have like a lot of sway, right? So in terms of like the actual legislative process, you might see like relatively moderate things coming out of the Biden administration if the question becomes something like, what does Joe Manchin want to do on healthcare? On the other hand, on all other issues, I see no reason not to see increasingly like back and forth in terms of executive actions. So if you look at like immigration, there's like a pretty clear like polarization and on that issue. And so for instance, for the next year, President Trump set a refugee resettlement cap of 15,000, and Joe Biden has promised a cap of 125,000. So in terms of executive actions, I think you can expect to see like really dramatic shifts from administration to administration where the executive is the primary actor. The other thing where you might see increased conflict is about confirmations, right? So we saw that the Republicans blocked Merrick Garland's appointment in 2016. So there's this issue, if you have the Senate and the president held by different parties, might we reach an era where presidents increasingly rely on acting secretaries? They're simply unable to get any of their appointees through. Maybe like the Secretary of Defense will be able to get through because there's like a patriotic move, but you could definitely see an issue perhaps where like Trump is refusing to appoint a Secretary of Education that's acceptable to Senate Democrats or vice versa.
So a slight follow-up, where do you see, so based on the actual election outcome this year, those parties go based on the schisms that they've had internally at this point?
So I think the most likely outcome is that Joe Biden does win the election, right? He's leading in most swing states. He's leading nationally by a substantial margin. And there's now really tight correlation between presidential votes and Senate votes. So I expect there are Democrats, if Biden, conditional on Biden winning, they'll probably have a Senate majority. So I think Congress in economic terms maybe relatively moderate, but certain concessions that like Democrats may have made in the past, for instance, to like social conservatives, like for instance, the Equality Act, right? To what extent might, so it's essentially some 1964 rights protections to like basically sexual orientation, gender identity. Will that have like carve outs for religious institutions or not? And those kind of like concessions to the other side seem increasingly less likely. That's an example.
So the Russians have been very good for quite some time at manipulating media, social media, and other media to present a point of view. And they did so very effectively in 2016. They did not create the divisions, they exacerbated the divisions. The Chinese have been very good at basically espionage, but mostly for economic reasons. I don't know the degree to which that they have been actively trying to switch political allegiance or encourage differences. One could certainly say, despite the fact that the United States has intervened in the democratic processes of other countries, that other countries intervening in the democratic processes of the United States is an act of, not of war, certainly one of violation of diplomatic and should be responded to accordingly. And that hasn't been the case. But I think if Biden's elected, it will become a bigger issue in terms of U.S. interactions with both Russia and China and other countries that are doing it. One thing I'd just like to add, if Biden is elected, and whether the Democrats take the Senate or not, you will see at some point in the next 6 months or 6 months after January, a revival of a movement to have another constitutional convention. This is something that surfaces every now and then, and it usually accelerates when Democrats hold the White House. And if there's another constitutional convention, all bets are on.
So we are about out of time, but I wanted to provide both of you just an opportunity to provide any closing remarks that you might have.
I've been around for a long time. I've been a denizen since 1993. And one in the college environment often finds students nostalgic for a previous time when things were more interesting, a previous time when things were better, a previous time that they would have preferred to live because the music was better or what have you. You are living in extraordinary times. And it's not necessarily fun and it's not necessarily enjoyable, but it is definitely very interesting. And when you are my age, you will be talking to the people your age and telling them how remarkable the time was when you were in college. Did I leave you an opening? Or?
Sure.
Yeah.
So last night I was watching the vice presidential debate, and Senator Harris made several promises on behalf of the potential Biden-Harris administration on criminal justice, for instance, right? She promised an end to private prisons and cash bail and some other promises. So they can certainly do that pretty quickly at the federal level, but a lot of the issues people really care about are primarily decided at the state and local level. So if you're planning on voting this November, I would encourage you to think about who you're going to vote for like school board, local prosecutor, and state legislature, and not just vote for president. Yeah.
And did she make news last night when she said that the Biden
the marijuana thing came out of nowhere. I was like, what did he say that? Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, she said that a Biden administration would decriminalize marijuana federally, and he's never said that before. No. So it's like, oh.
Got the Bill Maher vote right there.
So.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your time with us. I think everyone here joining virtually really appreciates it. This series will continue next week. Next Thursday, we'll be talking about COVID-19 and the U.S. economy with some professors from the economics department from 12 to 1 p.m. in Burton Morgan Lecture Hall, and also virtually via Zoom. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now in the old days, I'd go over, shake Thomas's hand, maybe we have a little this,
Yeah.
and I'd say, oh, you want to go down to the village? But no.
Yeah.
Soon again.
I get extra credit for coming, right? That's okay. I get extra credit for coming, right?
Thanks for asking.